People say that COVID-19 is the new normal. In as much as I would like to disagree, they are not far from the truth. Today, we are talking about the effects COVID-19 has had on the youth. And we are honored to have in the studios today Dr. 𝐤𝐸𝐳, a global health practitioner. Welcome, Dr. Ken.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you here. So today we are talking about effects of COVID-19 on the general well-being of young people. So what is the global and the Ghanaian outlook on the pandemic so far?
So thank you very much for having me. In your preamble, you did mention that COVID-19 seems to have become the new normal, and I tend to agree, because most of the things we do now tend to be situated within the context of whether we are looking at social distancing, people working from home, or even gatherings that are not necessary, and all of that. And so it is probably one of the most significant things that has happened within our generation that has caused a shift with the way with which we interact with people, we live our lives, and all of that. Almost 2 years down the line since the outbreak of COVID-19, unfortunately, globally, we've lost over 5 million people.
Whoa.
And somebody might think 5 million is not a lot, but 5 million people represent probably almost the entire population of either Congo or Denmark or Sweden. So imagine waking up one morning and there is no country called Denmark because everybody died of a particular condition. And that is what we are looking at. Almost 280 million people have tested positive for the virus. And Ghana, like most countries around the world, have not been spared when it comes to the scourge of COVID-19. You would realize that in this country, we've lost almost over 1,000 people to COVID-19. As it stands now, this morning, about 1,184 people have lost their lives to a particular condition, as devastating as that sounds. And so it has probably impacted our lives more than anything that anybody can think of within this particular generation. The outlook also with regards to getting people protected from COVID-19 have also seen a lot of people vaccinated globally. For example, there are countries in this world that have had the ability to vaccinate over 78% of their population. In countries like South Korea, in the United States, about 57% of the people have been fully vaccinated. But if you make a comparative analysis of that with sub-Saharan African countries like Ghana, the difference is extremely clear, to the extent that just about 2.7% of the entire population in this country have had the opportunity to be fully vaccinated. A little over 4% have been partially vaccinated, which doesn't give them or confer on them any full immunity against getting this particular disease. And so the pandemic, the global outlook is that it has actually been able to clearly define equity lines between countries, between individuals, and between groups. And I'm glad that we are having this conversation today, because then eventually we would come to understand how young people who purportedly were not a target of the disease have been impacted overall. And so we've had some challenges going forward. The outlook in this country has been the fact that we haven't had a steady supply of vaccine, and that means that a lot of people who wish to be vaccinated haven't had the opportunity to be vaccinated. But I'm glad that there's been quite a steady trickling in of vaccines of all kinds. As of now, we've had the opportunity to vaccinate people with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a 2-dose vaccine. We've also had the opportunity to vaccinate people with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a 1-dose vaccine. And then I understand that based on the benevolence of some high-income countries, we've been able to secure some doses of Moderna and Pfizer. The last time we had a conversation, I told you about some of the issues with those particular vaccines, in that those vaccines tend to have a special condition with which they have to be stored, and they require ultra cold freezers for them to be stored. And subsequently, I think government has been able to get some ultra cold freezers that they've been able to secure some doses of Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So going forward, the outlook is some way or the other it's better than it used to be with the last time we had a conversation.
Yeah.
Because some communities or some hotspots in the country have had the opportunity where people among those populations have been vaccinated. And I hope that a lot more people get vaccinated in this country. And I believe strongly that that probably is the only way with which we can end this pandemic and the effects it has on probably every population, including ours.
Okay, so we're told that young people are the least at risk of having COVID-19. So I want to know, has young people been spared from the pandemic?
So thank you very much. The initial narrative of young people being not at risk of getting COVID-19 over the period have come under question. And that is because we've come to realize that initially, most of the people that were passing on as a result of getting infected with the COVID-19 virus were older people. And so the narrative then became, oh, it's a disease of older folk and people with some underlying conditions. But over the period of time and with the evolution of the disease, with regards to some mutations of the virus that have resulted in different variants, we've come to realize that that may not necessarily be the case. You would realize that a lot more younger people have been infected with the Delta variant of the virus. And I would want to take the opportunity to let people know that the Delta variant is not just the only variant. There are about 10 different variants of the COVID-19 virus as it stands now. But the Delta variant seems to be the variant of concern. A variant worth monitoring, other variants from Alpha, Beta, all the way to Mu, Lambda, and Zeta. About 9 different variants of the virus are available in different populations or circulating within different populations. But young people are beginning to, in some way, become quite a very significant population that have been hospitalized with regards to the Delta variant. And so, that notwithstanding, we are trying to change the narrative in giving a false sense of security to young people that they may not necessarily be at risk of having either severe implications or complications from getting COVID-19 virus. Aside from that, we also heard about the multi-system inflammatory disease in children. Initially, children were not necessarily considered to be at risk of getting COVID-19, but we realized that children that acquired COVID-19, even though it's rare, most of them resulted in having the multi-system inflammatory conditions that were difficult to deal with. To some extent, in the data that is coming out of the number of people testing for COVID-19 or testing positive for COVID-19, if the data was disaggregated, we would realize that as a young person, your risk of getting COVID-19 disease depends on your income level and also depends on where you stay. In as much as the disease normally started with high-income countries and they have older populations. So, of course, eventually they were the ones that got more of it. So we made it look as if it was a disease of the old. But if you compare data from probably Kenya or Paraguay to data from Spain, you would realize that about 25% of the people testing positive for COVID-19 in Paraguay are below the age of 20. And these are young people, as opposed to 0.8 or 0.83% of the people from, for instance, Spain. So if the data is disaggregated or you de-aggregate the data, you come to realize that all along, young people have been at risk of getting COVID-19 disease. But the narrative initially also made it look like, oh, if I am a young person and I have symptoms, then there's a likelihood that it may not be covered because it is purported to be a disease of the old. Yeah. And so they don't get tested for it. And so we may have missed a lot of young people getting infected with COVID-19 who never got tested for it because they did not think that they would fall into the category or the subpopulation that were at risk most. But young people have not been spared.
Okay, so what is the current health situation with regards to young people and COVID-19?
So a lot more young people are now getting tested for COVID-19, and we are beginning to realize that a lot more young people are getting the disease. For instance, in countries like the UK and the United States, where they have the capacity to de-aggregate their data, we've come to realize that high levels of infections are as a result of people below the age of 20 and in some cases below the age of 30. And so young people are equally at risk. Health-wise, we've realized, like I said, in children, where they have the multi-system inflammatory disease, they tend to suffer a lot more severe complications with having COVID-19 than maybe younger adults or middle-aged people. So young people in general are at risk, and it is imperative that we make this clear so that they don't resort to more riskier behavior because they think that they are not necessarily the population that could possibly get COVID-19.
Okay, so I want us to zoom into the impact of the pandemic on the general well-being of young people. So have young people been generally absolved from the effects of the pandemic?
So young people probably, with all the untold hardships that COVID-19 came with, probably its most damaging legacy would be its impact of young people. And I would further elaborate why. This is because COVID-19 related policy interventions or the restrictions that came with COVID-19 tend to have had more secondary effects on young people than it did with older folk. For example, you look at education, for instance. If you take Ghana, for instance, schools were closed for a period of over 10 months. And that means that a lot of young people had to stay at home. And that comes with its own implications. Either they stayed at overcrowded housing facilities with their siblings that made learning impossible. That is one of the effects it had on young people. There's also the situation where we might debate the quality of food with regards to Ghana's food school feeding program. But missing school for 10 months means that lunches for some students who probably could not have a very healthy meal if they had not gone to school also missed out on those lunches. And as a result of that, their nutritional status was impacted. Most education moved online, and you can understand that the pervasiveness of internet services within lower middle income countries is not the best. About probably majority, 60% of students in this country do not necessarily have a computer at home. And so when education moves to virtual spaces, those people do not have the capacity to be able to participate.
Even in school, I don't think that they have enough facilities or computers to cater for every student.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the ICT training that they are supposed to have is even compromised in that sense. And then all of a sudden they are asked to go home and they are supposed to join tuition and educational resources that are available virtually, either via television or on a computer. And most of the children did not have access to these digital devices. And so their education, and most of them, if you look at primary school children, secondary school, either junior high or senior high, their educational trajectory was truncated as a result. And that is going to have long-term consequences. Because, again, most students learn a lot from being interactive with their peers.
Yeah.
And then even if they have access to a digital device to be able to join classes, they have to do that in the confines of their homes. And that as well had some detrimental effect, predisposing some young people to abuses. The other very key thing with staying at home and even having school is that most homes are not conducive for school participation and learning. And so it wasn't effective. That is the outcome of it. The other thing that we have to talk about is that staying at home in some way or the other may reinforce gender normative chores. For instance, when students are in school, they are exempted from having to do chores at home. But in the event that a girl child, for instance, is at home 24/7, and that means that the requirements of doing dishes and cooking, which are in most homes gender normative roles, then become exacerbated, in some way derailing the hard-earned progress that we've made in girl child education. You would also realize that there was an increase in most non-governmental organizations and gender organizations have reported high increase in the rate of teenage pregnancies.
Yeah.
And that is because kids did not have the safety of a school environment, and they had to stay at home. So having a kid as a teenager then has long-term consequences on the education of these people. And so, like I said, of all the things that COVID-19 has come onto this world with, its impacts on young people may probably prove to be the most damaging going forward in the long term.
Okay, so I think we've talked about education. Can we look at health-wise and also social-wise?
So I would want to talk about some other aspects of society that, with regards to young people, that this particular pandemic have had some deleterious consequences, and that is, for instance, economics and livelihood.
Yeah.
So young people tend to be associated with the very vulnerable jobs. For instance, I'll give you a typical example, like the hospitality industry, waitressing and tourist guides and hotel staff mostly encompasses relatively younger people, as opposed to older people. And the restrictions associated with the pandemic had very severe consequences on some of these industries. And eventually what that did was that it put a lot of young people out of job and livelihood, or to some extent the number of hours they could have had some contact with employment and gain some income was reduced because of lockdowns and restrictions and social distances, ban on traveling and all of that. And so as a result, you would appreciate the fact that a lot of young people had loss of livelihood, and a lot of household or younger household suffered the same. And what we've come to realize is that, one, the loss of livelihood, the loss of income, has a very huge impact on what we call the health-seeking behavior of people. For example, I could have a headache, but depending on how much money I have in my pocket, I could have to choose between seeking healthcare and buying food.
Yeah.
And most often than not, food wins. and so it has a way of impacting on the health-seeking behavior of people. That is one. Then on the flip side, most homes that suffered some income loss tend to put younger children to work, and there is an increase in child labor as a result. You would see a new phenomenon where you get in front of health institutions and you have relatively younger children, below 6 years old, selling face masks and hand sanitizers. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. And that is because some of these homes have had a loss in income, and then the younger children have been asked to augment the income of these homes. And so, to some extent, the economic and then the livelihoods of young people have probably been way more impacted. And you would realize that going forward, we are still not at pre-pandemic levels of employment globally for younger people. That's still because businesses are beginning to recover. There is another aspect of the economic and the livelihood part of the impact that I would want to talk about. Most businesses have evolved over the period due to the lessons they learned from the lockdowns into a more digitalized and virtual space. And like you said previously, how is the younger workforce equipped to take up those roles of ICT-oriented commerce and jobs? Especially when you look at a comparison between urban and the rural divide, then the equity lines are stuck because people from rural areas are ill-equipped to take up the roles that businesses and jobs are evolving into, which is digitalization of those businesses. And so that in the long term predisposes them to being unemployed. Before the pandemic, young people not in education, employment or training were over 867 million people. Just at the onset of the pandemic, we had a very huge increase to over 1 billion young people who were either not in education, not in employment, or not in training. And we are still gradually looking for ways and means to be able to get back to pre-pandemic levels and even do better than that. And so it creates a stark picture for young people. On the health side, I already originally talked about the fact that because of the kind of data we were looking at, we realized that going forward, we made it look like it was an elderly people's condition, but we've come to realize that a lot more younger people are getting infected and suffering the consequences of the pandemic. Again, the nutritional status of younger people are probably reduced. One, because economically, you realize before lockdowns in most West and Central African countries, there was a huge hike in inflation. Gari that people used to buy a bowl for 2 days.
It really like I don't know. I haven't bought Gary in a very long time. The last time I went to buy Gary, I was shocked as to the price of Gary in the market right now.
Exactly.
And I'm like, people tout that Gary is like food for, it's a very affordable commodity, and then now Gary is like competing with other foods. It's crazy, yeah.
So it's all consequence of the onset of the pandemic and the restrictions that followed. A lot more of these commodities that could have been affordable to homes all of a sudden became unaffordable. And so there is the dissipation of disposable income within homes, and people have to make hard choices. And so all of these goes to influence the nutritional status of homes, especially with younger people, and then it has an impact on their health. There are other situations that we would look at. For instance, in terms of health, accessibility to interventions. For example, children or younger people who previously, before pandemic, could have access to reproductive health care interventions. Most of these centers closed down to inhuman or face-to-face interactions. And so those services were no longer available for younger people to be able to have access to all of these interventions that were available to them before, and that predisposed them to very unhealthy practices and choices. And so the pandemic in itself it probably has, like I keep saying, younger people have been at the brunt of its effects way more than older people probably. The other thing I want to talk about is mental health. You would realize that going forward with this pandemic, a lot of people had to isolate and get away from their routine social interactions. And younger people were not spared of that. And younger people are more akin to having a social life as opposed to older people who are occupied by either a steady job or with family and other things. And so the impact on it have actually been high. A lot more people have actually reported in countries where studies have been done. They've reported increased levels of anxiety and depression among younger people as a result of the pandemic. And this is as a result of the fact that most of the younger people could not routinely interact with their folk. The peer experience was taken away from them, something they've never been used to. And that has resulted in huge levels of mental health disorders among younger people. The unfortunate part of it is that it's happening within a time where the services available, like the counseling and then the therapies available to be able to support younger people to get through these periods, are also not available because the pandemic restrictions have resulted in these services being truncated. And so we need to, as a people, begin to recognize that younger people are suffering way more than the older folk, as like we talked before. Had a conversation with a younger person who probably lost a relative. And most of the older people that passed away, we seem to forget the fact that it's the younger people that have to grieve and grieve for those younger people. And that comes with its own emotional stress. As a result of that, they were not even, because of restrictions, able to properly mourn the dead that they suffered as a result of the pandemic. We've lost sight of a lot of things that the Survivors Guild does to younger people. Some have lost parents, some have lost grannies they were close to, some have lost friends, some have lost mentors, and all of this have had some emotional stress on the younger people, combined with being isolated from their folk, combined with the massive influx of misinformation as a result of this pandemic, the infodemicity of the falsehood about the COVID-19 and the vaccines and all of that, young people have had it tough over this past 2 years, and we need to begin to recognize that we as a society need to do something about what young people have gone through.
Okay. Another thing that I want us to talk about is, you see, with the vaccines, I think a lot of information was circulated as to which people were eligible for the vaccines. I think they were catering to older people who are susceptible to contracting COVID than the younger people. Can we say that it's because of that there is vaccine hesitancy among young people? Because the last I was having a conversation with someone, and then she went on and on about how the vaccines are there, but people, especially young people, aren't forthcoming with it, and they do not want to take it and all of that. So could that be the prioritizing of the older people? Could that be the reason there is a high vaccine hesitancy among young people?
It is one of the reasons. There are a myriad of reasons as to why young people are hesitant in taking the vaccine, and one of them is what you just described. The narrative from the beginning made it look as if it wasn't a disease that young people should be bothered about.
Yeah.
And if it is not a disease that young people should be bothered about, for example, a vaccine is not a drug. And so the impression is, why am I taking a drug for a disease I don't have or I'm not likely to get? But like I said, that may probably also be evidenced by the picture we are looking in countries where majority of the older folk have been vaccinated. Now we are seeing a lot more younger people who are actually being hospitalized as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah.
Some of the other reasons why there's a huge hesitancy within the younger folk is also because of the fact that they are mostly the online folk. And there's been a lot of misinformation with regards to the vaccine and why people should not get it because of A, B, C, D reasons. Most of them false. And as a result of that, we've realized that a lot of young people seem to have a erroneous impression about the safety of the vaccine in itself, and also their risk of getting COVID-19 or suffering any consequences even if they contract it. So I strongly believe that the narrative would have to change, and that is why I appreciate what we are doing here today. Letting young people understand that they are not immune from the consequences of the disease, and they should be part of the conversation of looking for interventions to stop this pandemic. I would also say that initially when the vaccines came, there was a prioritization of older people, like you said.
Yeah.
And so now that there seem to be smaller numbers of people getting infected, then the question is, why should we get it?
I mean,
yes. So the conversation hasn't been had right, and that is because it was not participatory of younger folk and their needs. Also, the positive peer influence was missing from the beginning of the vaccination, and that is because school systems were not there where young people are more likely to listen to a teacher, listen to somebody they look up to in school, a senior.
Yeah.
But that interaction was non-existent because schools have been closed down. And so I strongly believe that we may need to reinvent the conversation in a way that involves younger people, their needs. A younger person told me that, in fact, they made it look like it was their fault that people were dying from the vaccine because they said they were carriers of the virus.
Yeah.
Like they were blamed for the deaths that were happening. So I think to some extent they feel aggrieved that they haven't been part of the conversation, and some blame is being apportioned to them. We need to get young people involved and in the conversation, in the planning, in the implementation, and to be able to instill some positive behavioral changes among this particular population. They are at the very core of the future of our economies, the future of our society. And so if we can get them to be positive influences going forward with regards to our fight of this pandemic, I think going forward to some extent we can make headway.
Okay, so if you just joined us, this is the Young Voices Forum, and today we are talking about the effects COVID-19 has had on young people. You can leave your comments and your questions in the comment section. If you have any question, you can leave it down and then it can be addressed later on. Or you have any contribution, you can leave them in the comment section and it will be addressed later on. So Dr. Ken, I want us to go back to the economic livelihood thing. You see, when we talk about young people, I think in Ghana, the age, if you're youth, it ends at 31 or so. So we are not just talking about young people of school-going age or young people in schools. We are talking about young people that are done with school too. What effects has the COVID had on the employment sector?
So, thank you very much. The entire economy globally, as a result of the pandemic, had a downturn, and mostly the most affected areas was the services industry. For example, let me use myself as an example. When I finished senior high school, like most people, you normally have the opportunity to teach in a private school.
Yeah.
Now,
did you?
I did.
Oh.
In the event that schools are closed for 10 months, that is 10 months of lost livelihood and income.
Yeah.
Imagine what that does to a younger person whose entire sustenance is dependent on teaching in a private school.
Yeah.
Somehow, some governments and I think the government of Ghana to some extent attempted to mitigate some of these economic things, but all in all, it has very, very serious implications for people. Most businesses had to shut their doors, either because their services were impacted by the restrictions. For instance, some hotels lay empty for months because there was a travel ban and people could not come in and people could not go out. And as a result of that, they had to lay off staff. Pre-pandemic times, they would have been employing new people into the industry. Some companies and factories had to close, not necessarily because the restrictions affected their products or the sale of their product, but most of the products that they use or the raw materials were imported, and then they did not have the opportunity because it was a global pandemic that other countries had shut down their borders and they could not get the raw materials in, and so they were forced in a way to lay off staff to be able to survive. And so a lot more young people have had the wrong end of this particular stick when it comes to COVID-19. And I should probably encompass this in what we call the social determinants of health. We've come to understand in public health that a lot more of what determines an individual's health is not necessarily whether the person is living in a community that have a hospital and specialist or not. It has to do with where the person lives, grows, works, and all of that tends to impact the person's health. And poverty tends to have a very direct link between being healthy and being unhealthy, because depending on your income bracket, you probably would make better life choices than other people who are probably in the lower income bracket. And so all of these economic unfortunates that happened with regards to the pandemic drove a lot more people into poverty. Even people who could maintain their jobs. For example, the prices of goods and services went up because of the scarcity involved in it. And so I remember when people used to sell face shields for 200 Ghana cedis and all of that. And people were forced to do it. And so that was monies that they could have used for other things being diverted into buying protective, personal protective equipment. And
you know why I'm laughing? It's because you say, I remember when. It sounds like it was like 20 years ago, but then it's like,
it hasn't been very long.
It hasn't been very long at all.
Now nobody will buy a face shield for 2 cedis. I have a friend of mine who invested heavily in it, and she's been making a lot of donations in that regard. She's become a face mask philanthropist as a result. And that might sound funny, but that is loss of income because she made an investment that did not bear fruit, and she's a very young person. And so as a result, you realize that most of these people had probably spent up their savings and dissipated their disposable income. And because of that, their health choices have become different. They don't eat probably healthier foods like they used. Now, what they eat is dependent on how much it is and how much they can afford it. And all of that we would see going forward within a period of time that people will begin to report a lot more increased levels of non-communicable diseases like the hypertension and the diabetes, because it even interrupted people's routine exercise and regimes. Gyms were closed as a result of that. So more younger people tend to have suffered economically, and when it comes to this pandemic, and then the pandemic-related interventions or restrictions that came with it.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about effects, impacts, and all of that. Now I want us to look at what can be done to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on the health and well-being of young people. First of all, as young people, what can we do?
So, thank you very much. Young people are critical in every intervention that we need to. We have to be involved, and that is because most often than not, the decisions are made, and then attempts are made to implement it for younger people when they were not at the table of discussion. So young people themselves need to be vocal. Young people need to have conversations. They need to be able to understand the circumstance we are in at this particular moment, and need to be able to advocate for changes that position them within the space where the conversation is being had, such that their inputs, their aspirations, and their concerns are addressed within that particular space. And then also, young people are critical to ending this pandemic in the first place. Young people need to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
And as young people, the tendency is not to probably adhere to protocols and all of that, but at least get vaccinated. That is because you can see that there's a relaxation of some of the restrictions. Social centers are up and going now. People, today is Friday, and a lot of people are going to be out there with their friends, and that's a healthy social interaction. But if most of these people are vaccinated, then we are looking at cordoning them off getting infected, and as a result of that, they can pass on the infection to more vulnerable individuals in society, so that we can bring an end to the pandemic. Young people themselves need to be agents of change, and that is, I say that with a lot of conviction, that I believe that we've heard over and over that young people are the future of this country, and globally it's understood, but we ourselves need to actually define the future that we want. And I've seen young people actively involved in issues of climate change, actively involved in reproductive health. We need young people to be actively involved in this particular pandemic as well. And that means that they need to be vocal and be advocates of creating that environment where their voices are heard. Change is not an easy thing to come by. And so they themselves have become pivotal in moving away from where we are as a society with regards to this pandemic into going into a post-pandemic age where they become key players in moving society forward.
Okay, so what about the government?
So government has a fiduciary role to play when it comes to the health and the safety of everybody. They are stewards of the country. And so government, and especially the government of Ghana, needs to coin pro-youth or pro-young people interventions. Going forward, young people needs to be at the fulcrum of the post-pandemic interventions. For example, the pandemic has exposed inequity lines that shows that, people in urban areas and people in rural areas, there's a huge gap in terms of development, in terms of accessibility to internet, in terms of healthcare infrastructure, in terms of educational facilities. And government need to proactively prepare people living in these areas to be able to more resilient in the event that they have to go into taking decisions that causes restrictions to access to school, so that schools can be moved online and everybody can participate. Now, if you probably want to measure the years between people living in rural areas and people living in urban areas with regards to the break in education, those living in urban areas will have a smaller break in number of years or informative years of education as compared to those who live in rural areas, because they have absolutely no access to internet services that could allow them to be participating in virtual classrooms or even having access to televisions and all of that. And so development has to be a resilient development, and that means that we have to continuously upgrade services in terms of ICT infrastructure, in terms of educational facilities, in terms of healthcare, in terms of even the economic circumstance of the population within the country, such that they can resist some of these shocks that we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic in the event that we have to go into that. Again, there have to be some accelerated development in upscaling certain parts or certain vulnerable groups. For instance, children and women who are mostly impacted by some of these changes in societal shift like we've had with COVID-19 needs to be a primary agenda of government. And then also government needs to take responsibility for moving society, especially younger people, from this pandemic age into the post-pandemic age. And that means that they need to be equipped. For example, I talked about ICT training. Most companies are, in one way or the other, becoming ICT oriented. How equipped are kids who are being trained at this moment to be able to take up those roles? The jobs may be there, but if government doesn't proactively initiate interventions that equip and resource younger people, they may not be able to adequately take up those roles. So government has a very huge responsibility when it comes to improving the stock of younger people and vulnerable groups post-pandemic. And I believe that the discussion even goes beyond government. Civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations do also have some hugely marginal roles to play, in as much as they need to inform policies that are pro-young people or that are young people inclusive. The pro-young people tends to scare the older people. So we use a more diplomatic term. It should be young people inclusive. It should be participatory. Yeah. That young people are part, they are on the table, they are informing the interventions and the policies and the decisions going forward. And they themselves are part of the implementation of those decisions. And then we can be able to move society into a post-pandemic stage. Africa, unfortunately, we are a relatively younger continent, unlike some of the very high-income countries. And so, in one way or the other, it is more a responsibility of African governments, especially we are in Ghana, and so Ghanaian government would have to look at this is the future of this country and it's the youth. So all these policies have to be youth-oriented, and as a result of that, we need to make a shift from what has been business as usual to making decisions that one way or the other would augment the capacities of the youth to be able to take up jobs, to be able to be entrepreneurial, to be able to have the adequate education that they require to be competitive globally, and also to be competitive within the job market.
That was a lot. So before we go, your final words. That's okay.
So I would want to tell young people not to despair, that we are in this together, and that there is the possibility to move beyond this pandemic. But that will require that all young people are involved, including yourself, including myself, and all the other young people that are listening to us. Our voices are important in shaping up the policies that informs the next few years after this pandemic. I would also like to encourage all young people to get vaccinated when vaccine services are available within your catchment area. As I speak right now, vaccine services are available at the Tamale Teaching Hospital, open to the general public. They have quite a considerable doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that we request that you can walk in there, ask anybody where the vaccination process is going on, and you can get vaccinated. A lot more people have also taken the first vaccine and not taking the second vaccine. And if you are one of those people, I would encourage you to complete your vaccination process because the vaccines are available at the moment. Young people should continue to be agents of change as much as possible. Let's be guarded in avoiding crowded spaces when necessary. Let's stick with the safety protocols of wearing a mask within a space if you need to. The hand sanitization and the hand washing, hand hygiene mechanisms, we should continuously be able to practice them. You might be immune or you might be protecting yourself, but somebody close to you might be a vulnerable individual that you are protecting. So we care for each other, we take care of each other, and then hopefully we will be able to move beyond this pandemic.
Okay, so we care for each other, we take care of each other, and hopefully we'll be able to move over from this pandemic. Usually I always have a lot to say when my guests are done, but today what I'm just going to say is exactly what he said. So thank you very much for joining us today. This has been a very insightful conversation. I myself am trying to unpack everything at this moment, so leave your comments, your questions, and your contributions in the comment section. If you want more information on the COVID-19, call the 𝐿𝐴𝐺 platform on 5100. It's absolutely free for people on MTN. So there are information available on mental health, on maternal health, and all of the things that also affect young people. You can call the 𝐿𝐴𝐺 platform on 5100 and get any information that you need. The nice thing about it is that they have several languages available, so if you're not comfortable with English or you're not comfortable with Twi, there are other languages too. There is Dagbani and all of that, so you can converse in the language that you are comfortable with or get information in the language that you best understand. So a very big thank you to you, Dr. Ken, for coming. We are very grateful. And also to my technical team. I always say without them there will be no Young Voices Forum. A very, very big thank you to you, Fatao. He's eyeing me right now, so if I do not thank him, Fatao, Arafat, MFA, and Alhaji Rashid. So until we come your way same time next week, my name is Rahel Entry, and it's bye for now.